Okay, the Latino civil rights movement. Okay, this would be a one PowerPoint deal, though it might be 2 lectures depending on how long it takes me. One thing, again, I'd like to emphasize, I don't know if I did a good enough job when I was talking about the civil rights movement, I'm going to adopt a lot of their positions to argue so you could get what their argument would be. And again, we all have the same goals when we talk about civil rights. Everybody wants everybody's life to be better, wants everyone's life to be equal, wants everyone to have an equal chance and an equitable life in our country. So we're all moving towards the same goal, maybe just in different ways. So, background, major themes of the Latino civil rights movement. Although progress had been made prior to this movement, some people call it the Chicano movement, some call it the Latino civil rights movement. There's all sorts of different names. I'll probably use them both interchangeably. Mexicans in the United States were still much poorer than white Americans. Segregation persisted in schools, neighborhoods, and public facilities. So when we think about segregation, it's not just the South. It's not just white people telling black people they can't use the same drinking fountain. It also meant in the South, white people telling brown people they can't use the same drinking fountain, or in the Southwest, I should say. So it was widespread. Okay? Many white Americans, from academics to politicians and journalists, will express surprise when they realize that Chicanos were beginning to protest their conditions publicly. The Chicano movement will emerge from a diverse array of political issues, which will help. Also, it will fracture a little bit as well. Many Chicano movement leaders had prior experience advocating for change in the 50s and 60s, including people that assisted in the black civil rights movement and were in the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And they used that experience in their movement, in the Chicano movement, in the Latino civil rights movement. So true or false, many white Americans were shocked when the Chicano movement started. Is that true or is that false? Back-to-back questions. Many of the leaders of the Chicano movement had gained experience as members of the black civil rights and anti-war movements. Is that true or false? All right, some background. In 1904, we formed the Border Patrol. It is not the same as it is now. Okay, the border was not particularly militarized or really guarded at all until after World War I. 1910, the Mexican Revolution forces many to cross the border looking for safety and employment. 1921, we passed the Immigration Act of 1921 that established quotas. And what that means is they looked back to the 1990 census. Actually, the first one was at the 1910 census, and they went back to 1890. So the census counts up all the Americans, and it helps you divide them into groups and figure out who's here and what all that stuff, right? So what they did is they took the quota from 1910 of how many people came from, say, Venezuela. Then they said 3% of that amount of people. So say, 100 people came from Venezuela in 1910 to America, then 3% of that can come in 1921, which means 3 people, right? So that's a very small example, but that's how the quota system worked, and that'll be in place until the 60s. 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens, also called LULAC, is formed to protect against discrimination, segregation, and to promote education. 1930s, we have massive deportations of Mexican Americans, of Latino Americans during the Great Depression. One thing I will note when we talk about all this stuff, right? I don't think people are inherently racist. I don't think America is full of racist people all the time or anything like that. But typically, racial issues become worse when economic issues become worse, right? I told you during the African American Civil Rights Movement lectures that we integrated poor neighborhoods, not rich neighborhoods, which helped increase the amount of violence during those integration movements because these people were already competing for jobs. They were not financially secure. When people are less secure, we tend to act worse towards each other, and that does include acting worse towards minorities at times. So in the 1920s, we encouraged lots of Mexicans to come to America. They did not have any quotas. We wanted them to come to the fields because we could pay them less to work in the fields. But then in the 1930s, when the Great Depression hits and the economy gets worse, the first group we're going to force out will be them, right? And we will deport them massively, thousands and thousands. 1942, the Bracero program begins. That's another program to lure Mexican laborers to America to work in the fields. They had to do this, or they wanted to do this because of 2 big reasons. Number one, 16 million American men were in the war, World War II, so we had a labor shortage. But also number 2, you could still pay Mexican laborers less. 1943, the Zoot Suit riots happened, which we've talked about. Some beating, some fighting, mainly by U.S. servicemen against poor black and brown youths for wearing Zoot Suits, which were seen as un-American because they used so much fabric, and the fabric was supposed to be rationed and kept for soldiers. 1945, Mendez versus Westminster. Okay, I misquoted the verses here when I was talking in the civil rights movement, other civil rights lectures, but Mendez versus Westminster would challenge school segregation, right? Where a young student by the name of Mendez was discriminated against based on race. It will not work, right? This challenge does not work, but it will be used to help overturn segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. 1953, Operation Wetback happens. Again, another mass deportation effort. Okay, 3.8 million Latino or Latin Americans were arrested and deported. A large percentage of them were American citizens, but because they were brown and there was competition for jobs and other ideas maybe floating around, we deported a lot of them. 1966, Miranda versus Arizona will establish that suspects must be read their rights during arrests and interrogations. So if you ever watch like Law and Order or any cop show, when they arrest you, they say you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, you can't afford one will be provided to, and there's all sorts of other things. They have to read those out because of a court case from Arizona involving a Latino man that was arrested for murder, which he was guilty of, but they didn't read him his rights, and they eventually had to have a retrial, and he was found guilty again. So, important Latino civil rights leaders. The most important, I suppose, or at least the most prominent that we will talk about is Cesar Chavez. He organized a bunch of migrant workers, right? The United Farm Workers movement, and he's going to become a very important person for this, right? So he's born in Yuma, Arizona in 1927. He spent his childhood as a migrant worker. So, I mean, they would come in seasonally, right? I want you to think about the border at this early time period, really up until the 30s, the late 30s, and into the 40s, into World War II. The border, I mean, even later than that, honestly. The border, I want you to think about it like sometimes when you go, it's like a mall or into a big city and you see a big office building, they got those they call them vestibules, they got those doors that spin, right? It's like a revolving door. I want you to think about the border like that. For a long, long time, thousands and thousands and thousands of Mexican workers would come across the border in the morning, work all day, and then go back across the border at night. And it worked that way for a very long time, right? Or you'd have people that would travel up to America for, say, like the harvesting season to work in the fields picking, and then they'd travel back to Mexico for the rest of the year or whatever, right? As the border becomes more hardened, and as we change some of those laws and stuff, then we'll get organizations like the United Farm Workers started by Chavez to improve the conditions of these workers, right? Improve their lives. Okay, so he will become an organizer for what's called the Community Service Organization, which was a Latino rights group in Los Angeles. He will meet a woman by the name of Dolores Huerta there, and they're going to do some insanely great work together in the idea of promoting Latino civil rights. So, eventually, he will leave the CSO, and he will organize the National Farm Workers Association, which eventually forms into what we call the United Farm Workers. Their most effective tactic is what we call the boycott, right? We learned about that at the forms of protest. They would literally get people or try to get people not to buy produce from large growers that treated their workers poorly. Okay? So they will urge supporters to not to buy products from companies that did not sign a contract with the union. If they sign a contract with the union, that contract would stipulate things like bathroom breaks, like lunches or regular breaks, equal or good pay, safer conditions, limiting hours, stuff like that. Basic things that we take for granted at our jobs. So, who was the most prominent leader or organizer of the Chicano movement? Was it A, Cesar Chavez, B, Dolores Huerta, or C, Rodolfo Gonzalez? So, speaking of Dolores Huerta, she was born in New Mexico. She moved to Northern California, eventually started working in the CSO with Cesar Chavez, and then will work with him, to help build farm working unions and to try to improve conditions for the people there. Okay? She didn't labor in the field. She was really just a labor organizer. Okay? So, we talked about the Bracero program briefly. It was a guest worker program that enabled migrant workers to obtain work visas. Was supposed to ensure basic human rights and a minimum wage, but it also made it much more difficult for them to try to increase wages, to strike, and to try to fix their working conditions. So unions will begin to organize against the Bracero program. Part of the reason that we had that Operation Wetback that I mentioned earlier, where 3.8 million people were deported, was that there were so many people that were not a part of the Bracero program that the United States decided they wanted to force them into it. So they'll deport people and then say, you can come back as long as you sign the paperwork to be in this Bracero program. But if you sign that paperwork, it also undercuts your ability to ensure that you have basic rights on the job, to improve your wages and improve your conditions. So it puts them in a bad position. 1964, the Bracero program will officially end, in part due to pressure from these organizations and its supporters. It is also part of the Civil Rights Act of 64 will help protect some of these workers to an extent. So, next question. What was the Bracero program? Was it A, the deportation of Mexican immigrants? B, a work visa program to bring Mexican labor into American fields? C, part of the Chicano movement? Or D, none of the above? Alright, so, timeline of events, and these events will be, early on, will be all about farm working strikes. 1965, on September 8th, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, began a strike against the DeGiorgio Corporation. The DeGiorgio Corporation was a incorporated farming group that basically controlled all the grape growing in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So, the agricultural workers go on strike, demanding that they get recognized and they get higher wages. The following week, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta will lead the NFWA in a vote to join the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee strike. Okay, so their group, Huerta and Chavez's group, is going to join with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to form an even bigger group going out on strike against the DeGiorgio Corporation. 66, okay, from March 17th to April 11th, Chavez, the NWFA, and the other group will all march from Delano to California, to the capital of Sacramento, to publicize their strike. They arrive on Easter Sunday. On August 22nd, the NFWA and that other group, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, unite to form the United Farm Workers, the UFW. Shortly thereafter, the DeGiorgio Corporation grants the UFW a membership contract, which means they can negotiate as a large union and they can make sure that people get better conditions. So it's a victory. It's a big victory there. But that is just against one group, and now they've got to get that organization together against the next big corporation, the Guamara Vineyards. So now they'll target them. This was the largest producer of table grapes in the entire country, and they will boycott all table grapes. So what they would do, quite literally, is they would picket in the fields, they'd strike in the fields, and then they would go to grocery stores throughout the country and say, hey, don't buy these grapes from the Guamara Vineyards Corporation. Don't buy their grapes because they treat their workers poorly. Buy the grapes from this company instead. This will last for 5 years, from 67 until 72, until they finally obtain a contract, a union contract with that corporation. Okay, but again, it'll work. 68, on February 15th, Chavez begins a 25-day fast at 40 acres near Delano, California. So he goes on a hunger strike. Shortly thereafter, he was summoned to court to respond to an injunction filed by the Guamara Corporation aimed at prohibiting picketing by the UFW. So I just told you that they got an agreement with that corporation, but they won't get that agreement until 1972. So back in 68, that corporation sues Chavez in court, saying that they cannot picket anymore, right? Chavez goes to court, tries to testify, but he faints. He's too weak to testify. The incident will gain national attention and sympathy. So because of his willingness to go on hunger strike, his willingness to do it prominently, more people will give their support to the movement. On March 10th, he will break his fast at a Catholic Mass in Delano's public park with 4,000 supporters. Including in those supporters will be Senator Robert Kennedy, who was running for president that year before his assassination. 1970, the UFW wins a major victory when 40 growers asked to negotiate contracts with them. So instead of having to strike against them, they saw how well these strikes and boycotts and pickets were working. 40 groups, 40 corporations say, hey, no, listen, let's just negotiate now so we don't have to go through all this battle. So Huerta leads to 2 months of negotiations that all resulted in better pay, a union hiring hall, creation of formal grievance procedures, restrictions on the use of pesticides, rehiring of strikers, and employer contributions to a health fund. So they get basic protections. An important thing to note in here will be the use of pesticides. We're still fighting battles over that. Just very recently, Roundup, the people who own Roundup, the weed killer, have been sued by a lot of people because it's been proven that they knew it caused cancer, and it's caused cancer in a lot of people. So that's a very big thing for them to have been able to negotiate in 1970. All right, in another victory, grape growers in Delano signed a 3-year contract with the UFW. Meanwhile, when Chavez refuses to call off a lettuce boycott, he's jailed and then released, which again, non-violent sort of stuff, sort of king-like, will gain more support for the movement. So, throughout the 60s, the United Farm Workers' best method for getting what they wanted was A, what? Boycotting, B, picketing, C, a news campaign, or D, violence. So there they are marching. The Huelga bird was one of their symbols. Unfortunately, it's been co-opted by some gang activity as well, which really, really sucks because it's a cool bird. But I digress. So before we get to the struggles in the cities, I'm going to stop right here for a second to talk about where we are currently in conditions for people working in the fields. Now, it's better than it used to be, but it still isn't great. And the one example I will give to you is we've had some outbreaks of things like salmonella or foodborne illnesses in crops, right? And they're generally leafy crops like spinach or lettuce, and they're something from some of these large agro-corporations. Whenever you hear of an outbreak like that, the most likely culprit of the sickness is human waste. And by that I mean the conditions aren't good enough for people to have enough breaks to go to the bathroom, so they go to the bathroom in the fields, and then some of that waste gets into crops, and some of that waste produces foodborne illnesses in those crops that then infects people. So this is still something that affects us right now, that could be improved right now, right? So there's still, none of these movements are really over, right? All right, off of that admittedly disgusting topic and into the cities, okay? So it wasn't just the Latino civil rights movement. The Chicano movement is not just about making things better for workers. It's also about making things better for Mexican Americans and Latino Americans throughout the country. So in 1960, the census counted nearly 4 million Mexican Americans in the country with a per capita income of $968, which means that on average, a Mexican American made $968 a year. You compare that with more than $2,000 for white Americans. The median school age for Latinos was 8th grade, 8.1, versus completing high school for white students. In Texas alone, the median grade level was 5th grade, 4.8 levels of grade. In San Antonio, Texas, only 1.4% of Chicanos had a college degree. In the same city, only 49.7% of the Mexican population lived in homes with plumbing. This is in the 60s versus 94% of white. So they have unequal schooling and unequal living conditions. In Los Angeles, segregation increased in schools. Mexican-American schools had overcrowded classrooms, a lack of Mexican-American teachers, and a high dropout rate. So by the year of 1968, 91% of all college students were white, 6% were African-American, and less than 2% were Latino. So when I talked briefly about affirmative action in the last one. Part of the reason why, at this point, the American government saw affirmative action as necessary were these numbers here on the top right, right? That the vast majority of college students were white, but I should also say there's white men. Through affirmative action, the group of people that got the most benefit in terms of jobs and educational benefit will be white women that had been held out of college education as well. So, other bullet point I want to talk about is where it said that Mexican-American schools were overcrowded. So, what they would eventually do, part of the reason, I'll go back a slide, part of the reason why these numbers are so bad on schooling is that a lot of kids will drop out or get kicked out of school when they see how bad the conditions are, right? They'll say, hey, there's 60 kids in my classroom, but there's only 30 desks, and there's only 30 books. We don't have teachers that look like us. It's been proven that kids perform better when they have teachers that are diverse and teachers that also represent them, right? When you see a teacher that looks like you. The high dropout rate was also an instance, like I said, people just not wanting to go to a school that's overcrowded and poorly run, but also a lot of kids that didn't speak English particularly well. We have ESL, English as a second language. We have ELL programs for English language learners. They didn't have that kind of stuff. So it really was speaking English slowly and loudly and expecting people to understand it. And if you couldn't understand it, then why continue going? So we'll have a lot of issues. In the 60s, many student groups were founded, including UMass, Mayo, and Mecha. And we'll talk maybe briefly about a couple of those. But in 1967, another group was formed. The Brown Berets were formed in Los Angeles to defend neighborhoods against crime and police brutality while also promoting cultural awareness and pride. So we had the Panthers get started in the Black Civil Rights Movement to protect against police brutality. We'll have the Brown Berets formed in LA to defend against police brutality there. So again, that's an issue that's been addressed in the community level a lot. There's been issues with it. There's been fighting over it. There's been argument over it. But only recently has it become such a big nationwide story. All right, so what were the Brown Berets organized to protect Chicano youth from? A, the government, B, other Latinos, C, the police, or D, white Americans. All right, so this will lead to some, these conditions in schools will lead to what we call the East LA walkout. So in March of 1968, nearly 10,000 Chicano students walked out of 5 Los Angeles high schools. Those high schools were Lincoln High, Roosevelt High, Garfield High, Wilson High, and Belmont High. The student walkouts were led by students. Okay, these kids will eventually become civil rights advocates for the rest of their lives. Prior to the walkout, the school system had pushed out more than 50% of Chicano students through either expulsion, transfers, or simply lack of caring. So like we said, or like I said, a lot of kids saw that the school was underfunded and overcrowded, and they would just leave. A lot of other times, kids would get kicked out for minor offenses, including speaking Spanish. There was a no Spanish rule in a lot of high schools, and if you spoke Spanish, you got kicked out. So you see a lot of kids, 50% of Chicano students have been pushed out of school. So they marched to protest those conditions. So speaking of those marches, in March 1968, how many students walked out of 5 LA high schools? Was it A, 1,000, B, 5,000, C, 10,000, or D, 15,000? Okay, moving on. In 1967, only 3% of teachers and 1.3% of administrators in these 5 schools had Spanish last names. So again, there's not much representation, right? And I had the same issue in the school district I was in before, where there wasn't a lot of teachers that looked like the kids, which is something we should strive for because it improves economic performance. Anyway, Sal Castro, a teacher at Lincoln High School at the time, became a leading figure of these youngsters, both high school and some college students. He will be indicted by a grand jury for leading some of these walkouts. And there's a movie there called Walkout about it if you want to check that out. One of these student leaders, Montezuma Esparza, produced a film in 2006 about it, the walkout. So, other high schools will have walkouts, including here in Colorado, in Denver. There will be a huge walkout. There will be walkouts in San Antonio and in Phoenix, in Delano, California, among other mostly Latino communities. These walkouts, which spread throughout the Southwest, had a tremendous impact on their participants. Most of them remained activists and went on to get college diplomas because that had been enlivened in them at a young age. So the Crusade for Justice is focused on a little bit of what happened here in Denver. On March 20th, 1968, students walked out of classes at Denver's West Side High School to demand the resignation of a teacher who had reportedly said in class that, quote, all Mexicans are stupid because their parents were stupid and their parents' parents were stupid. If you eat Mexican food, you'll look like a Mexican. Who knows what context all was said in, but enough kids thought that it was said in a very racist context that they walked out of the school. The protest went on for 3 days. 25 people again arrested, including Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, who eventually becomes a leader for the Crusade for Justice in Denver. So, he helped form that Crusade for Justice. There he is right there on the bottom left. The main role of the Crusade was for the Chicano movement was establishing cultural nationalism. And by that I meant figuring out a way that they can culturally fit in our country. At this point, these kids that are leading these walkouts were all American citizens. They were high school kids. They were the generation of their family that was part American and part wherever their family come from, Mexico or South America or Central America or whatever, right? And so they're trying to figure out a way to push the cultures a bit together and have a place here in America for themselves, right? That they can fit in and to nationalize their culture a little bit. So Gonzalez will write epic poems like I Am Joaquin that became the anthem for the movement, for the movimiento. All right, MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, was formed in San Antonio, Texas in 1968 with help from the Ford Foundation to promote and protect the civil rights of Mexican Americans through class action litigation, community education, and leadership training. So MALDEF, I want you to imagine that as sort of the Latino version of the NAACP. They're going to fight mostly through legal means to try to ensure equity and equality for Mexican Americans in our country. Vilma Martinez, here on the right, a lawyer from Texas, became its first general counsel from 73 until 82, or one of its first general counsels. So, true or false? MALDEF was formed to protect and promote the civil rights of Mexican Americans. True or false? All right. Another group, the Alianza Federal de Mercedes, will be a little bit more, or will be definitely more, militant. So I said at the beginning of this that the Chicano movement will be very diverse in political and political ideas and in tactics and in goals and all that sort of stuff, right? So this will be an example of a more militant side. And we'll see this in all the civil rights movements. We already talked about the African American. We'll talk about in other ones as well. So members of this group will occupy areas that had been ceded to the U.S. through war or treaty. So this goes all the way back to 1848 when we had the Mexican-American War, right? With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that basically gave the entire American Southwest to America, right? What we consider the Southwest, right? Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Colorado and Utah and Nevada and California all get given away, right, as part of the treaty. The Alianza will try to take that land back by basically going there and saying it's our land. We didn't agree to this. So when they were asked to leave, they will arrest federal officials themselves for trespassing. They'll give them tickets and saying you're trespassing on our land, which is kind of funny in a way. But then it turns very unfunny when they lead a raid on a courthouse and kill a person, right? So a much more militant part of this. Ruben Salazar, this will be a non-so-militant, but it'll lead to a riot. Ruben Salazar was a local newspaper and TV reporter that was killed when sheriff deputies fired a tear gas canister into the bar he was in, hitting him in the head and killing him. What makes this much more controversial is that Salazar had been directly warned by the LAPD. They told him to stop doing his job as a reporter. He was reporting on police brutality cases in Los Angeles. And the LAPD told him to stop doing that. He refused. Then they're going to go and shake up the bar he's in. Right? They're going to shoot with tear gas and force everybody out just to make his life worse, kind of as a threat type of thing. And then they killed him. It appears that the killing was accidental, but this is going to lead directly to the East LA riots because, of course, people are going to say, hey, you killed the guy. You warned the guy to stop reporting on what you're doing. That's bad. Then you killed him. Of course, people are going to riot after that. So there will be riots. In Los Angeles, 40 people get hurt and one person will die in this round of rioting. So what caused the East LA riots? A, they came out of nowhere. B, the murder of a journalist. C, school problems. Or D, the Bracero program. All right, Crystal City, Texas. Okay, will probably be the last thing I talk about before I have to, actually maybe I'll do two more things. All right, so in 1969, Jose Angel Gutierrez and several young volunteers began to organize politically in their hometown of Crystal City, Texas. So they're going to form their own political party. Although Chicanos made up 85% of Crystal City, Texas, a minority of white people, so the 15% minority, controlled 95% of all the land and all of the city's politics. The median year of education for Chicanos in Crystal City, Texas was second grade. More than 70% were dropped out or forced out through the no Spanish rule. I told you before, in some schools they wouldn't let kids speak Spanish or they'd kick them out. This all reaches a head in 1969 when 2 cheerleader positions opened at the high school in Crystal City, Texas. Chicano students were told that they could not fill the vacancies because the quota of 1 had been met. So the school said, we will have 1 Chicano student on the cheerleading squad. The rest of the cheerleading positions are available for white kids. So parents freaked out, obviously, because their kids wanted to be on the cheerleading team. So they take it to the school board. The school board also said, you know, we're going to keep that rule, and we're also going to impose a requirement on any candidate for cheerleader that at least one of their parents has to have graduated from high school. I just told you the average education was only second grade for the Chicanos in that community, so that makes it even harder for a girl or a guy to get on the cheerleading team. So after that, there will be several days of protest. 1,700 students will walk out of school. Their parents will form a citizens organization and decided that Mexicans would take over the school board to change the law or the rules there to make it more equitable for their kids. So they target the election of 1970 to do so. In April, the group of parents and students had created a political party, and they had won 4 of the 7 seats, which means they had the majority, which means they could get rid of that stupid quota law or quota rule that the school had put in place. They also elected Chicano City Council members and even mayors. In 1972, they held their first political party, or first political convention, I'd say, in El Paso, Texas. La Raza Unida was the name of their party. So some successes there, some organizing through the political system. All right, I'm going to pause here, make this a 2-parter because I got to go through the timeline from 1970 until right now. Right? So I will be back.